Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I arrived last night from New York after a 24-hour journey. So where's my cappuccino? Sorry, I'm drinking a lot of coffee in order to try to be as tweetable as possible in my comments. And also to try to be as interesting as possible, because when we talk about UN processes, immediately people's eyes glaze over. And people wonder, why should I care about what goes on in New York amongst these high-level diplomats who seem to only talk to themselves? It's true, they do only talk to themselves. I can testify to this, having spent a lot of time with them and realizing their days start at 8 a.m. with meetings with each other and end at 11 p.m. at a cocktail party with each other. And this is precisely why it's so important for us to break in to that conversation. Otherwise, it is a New York-based conversation that is not sufficiently based in our and your realities. So that's why I think it's important for you to understand a little bit about this process of developing a new development agenda and the implications of that agenda for your work. Let's start by talking about why justice should be part of the development discourse. Some of this you know, so I'll go through very quickly. I think Lorenzo probably became frightened when I emailed him my presentation last night with 25 slides. And he probably became terrified. I'm going to fly through many of these quickly. In fact, how do I do that? Okay. So first, why justice and development? Well, you know the answer to this already, but just quickly. If there is no justice, then there can be no sustainable development. There can be no, if people don't have rights to own property or land, they can't invest. If they don't have responsive criminal justice institutions, they don't have confidence that they can be safe, to go to school, to go to market. If they don't have legal identity and access to documentation, they can't open up a bank account, they can't get a cell phone, they can't go to school, they can't have access to government services. So I think it's probably quite obvious to all of you in this room why justice and the rule of law are crucial ingredients to sustainable development. But as Rob said, it's not always obvious to the diplomats who are negotiating these global agreements because they are disconnected, and we have to fill that gap between New York and the rest of the world. Okay. So in many of these processes that exist, the justice and development link has already been affirmed, but we have to keep affirming it again and again. The World Bank has affirmed this link, that you can't have sustainable development until you address poverty. You have to address injustice and insecurity in order to eradicate poverty. The UN General Assembly has also recognized this, that rule of law and justice are fundamental building blocks for sustainable development. Nonetheless, we have to continue to make this case in the current post-2015 process. What are we talking about when we talk about justice? Well, I won't get into the internal politics and structure of the Open Society Foundations. That could take another 2 or 3 days. But I will tell you that the way we have been talking about justice in the post-2015 development agenda is as follows. The Justice Initiative, for which I am the advocacy director, is a human rights law center within OSF, which is, as you know, a broader philanthropic organization. We at the Justice Initiative have defined justice for purposes of the post-2015 development agenda as comprising 5 elements: the right to information, access to legal identity, rights to land tenure, citizens' participation in monitoring essential services, and access to justice writ large. That is how we have been defining justice different people define it differently. We have been advocating for the inclusion of justice, public safety and security, and good governance in the post-2015 development agenda. That is our advocacy agenda in New York. What is this post-2015 development agenda? Well, it is the next iteration of the Millennium Development Goals. How many people in this room are familiar with or have dealt with the Millennium Development Goals? Okay, fabulous. Then I'm not going to spend any time on this slide except to show you the pretty picture which demonstrates these are the icons for the 8 Millennium Development Goals that were established in 2000 and are expiring in 2015. Unsurprisingly, we have not eradicated poverty by 2015, shockingly. So we need to renew the development agenda. And that is what the post-2015 development agenda process is about. It's about scaling up our efforts not just to reduce poverty, but to actually eradicate poverty. The new development agenda, what we're calling the post-2015 development agenda, really aims to correct some of the failings and shortcomings of the MDGs. As many of you who have worked on the MDGs will know, there were problems with the Millennium Development Goals. There were shortcomings. And there were problems in the development of the MDG process. People were not actually included in the development of the MDGs. So we're aiming to correct that deficiency by engaging very deeply in the post-2015 development agenda. But what is the process and why are we here? Well, as you know, just to remind you of a bit of the history, there was a Millennium Summit in 2000 at which the MDGs were negotiated. In 2010, the UN General Assembly said, we better see how we're doing on these MDGs. Looks like we're not going to make our goals. Looks like we need to accelerate progress, and frankly, we're going to need to extend the MDGs because we will not have eradicated poverty by 2015. In 2012, the Secretary General of the UN assembled a high-level panel of eminent persons to advise on the next development agenda. And that report, the high-level panel report, is it's a seminal document. And in 2013, that's when that report was released. So what are the key moments that we're dealing with right now in the post-2015 agenda? As you know, a sustainable development agenda we're building on Rio. And we're building on the Rio Plus 20 outcome document, and I know we have some Brazilian colleagues in the room, so it will come as no surprise to you that Brazil has tremendous ownership and investment in the Rio process, and as a consequence, is deeply invested in the post-2015 process. And in fact, it's great to see who's in this room now, because I would say in the New York context, the most important representatives in New York are reflective of who's here. It's the ambassador of South Africa, it's the ambassador of Brazil, it's the ambassador of Kenya, it's the ambassador of Colombia, it's the ambassador of Mexico, and then, not in the room, the ambassador of India. Those are probably the key political actors in New York in the post-2015 agenda process. And Brazil, because of Rio and the legacy of Rio, Brazil is deeply, deeply engaged, sometimes in a positive way and sometimes in a less positive way. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But just quickly, we've got a whole series of inputs into the post-2015 process, and I'm not going to spend too much time talking about the process, but I just want to show you if you were hoping that I would explain the process to you, that's not going to happen, because I'm going to show you 3 different formulations of this process and see if you can decode these better than I can. This is one formulation, this is another, and this is another. So this is what I'm embedded in. I bet you're all saying right now, I am so happy I don't work in New York. The process is incredibly complex, but there are a couple of key moments that I want to point out and key inputs. And if anybody is interested, I'm very happy to share this PowerPoint so that you can look more closely at these charts. So I mentioned a minute ago that there was a high, am I okay on time? That there was a high-level panel report which kind of started this whole thing, this post-2015 development process. And in that report, it talked about the need for transformative shifts in our conceptual thinking about what a new development agenda should look like. And these 5 transformative shifts that the high-level panel called for were: leave no one behind, put sustainable development at the core, transform economies for jobs and growth, build peace and effective, open, and accountable institutions for all, which is obviously quite relevant to this discussion today, and forge a new global partnership for development. After the high-level panel report, the next really big thing that happened was last July, after months of intergovernmental negotiations in New York. There was a body tasked by the UN General Assembly called the Open Working Group. And the Open Working Group, which was comprised of 30 governments, I won't go into the details, it released a report in July, and that report has formed the basis for the negotiations for the next development agenda. That Open Working Group outcome report, don't you love the way UN names things? It's so tweetable. That Open Working Group outcome report contained 17 goals and 169 targets for a new sustainable development agenda. Of greatest interest to us today is Goal 16, Open Working Group outcome document Goal 16, which is the justice goal. That goal says, the purpose of that goal is to promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, provide access to justice for all, and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. Goal 16 had a number of targets. Yes, the font gets smaller here. So I'm not going to read all of these targets, but you will note there are targets. The first target under Goal 16 is significantly reduce all forms of violence and related death rates everywhere. Goal 16, target 16.1 is your target for those of you in this room. What is the significance of the Open Working Group outcome document? Well, as UN processes go, this one I'm going to skip through to the next important moment where the UN Secretary General released a report in December, a couple of months ago, in which he said that Open Working Group outcome document with its 17 goals and 169 targets, that's good. That should form the main basis for intergovernmental negotiations for the next Sustainable Development Agenda. The Secretary General also said, I'm going to pull together all of the different strands of work that all of the different bodies have fed into this process, and I'm going to try to frame those and talk about what it's going to take to achieve sustainable development. And he said there are 6 essential elements of sustainable development: people, planet, partnerships, prosperity, dignity, and justice. His report is not a binding report, but it's an influential report, and we were extremely excited to see that justice was one of 6 essential elements to sustainable development, which is, of course, a shift from the MDGs, where justice was absent. So what's going on right now in New York? Do I have a couple more minutes? 5 more minutes, okay. Are you still awake? Am I being clear? Great. Okay, fabulous. What's going on now in New York? There are 3, just because it's always good to make things more confusing, there are 3 parallel processes in New York right now that are implicated in this discussion about the next development agenda. There are the intergovernmental negotiations for post-2015. There is the financing for development debate, which is going on. And then, of course, there's the climate change negotiations. These three processes are parallel and intersecting at points. The intergovernmental negotiations for the post-2015 development agenda aim to conclude in July with a draft of the new agenda. That draft is being negotiated right now, and there are sessions in New York every month, negotiating sessions. And we are participating in advocacy on the margins of those. The financing for development process is also going on right now, but it culminates in a conference in Addis Ababa in July. And that conference is extremely important because it's all about the resources. It's all about the money and the partnerships and the technical assistance and support, but most importantly, the money for the new development agenda. That conference in July in Addis, at that conference, heads of state and ministers will come and they will make commitments to resource a new development agenda, or they won't make enough commitments. So if the conference in Addis in July comes up with a new financing plan that developed and developing countries don't agree on, and that doesn't sufficiently resource a new development agenda, we could be in trouble with the post-2015 agenda that has been negotiated in New York. The most contentious discussions in New York right now, and I appreciated Rob's reference to the New York negotiations as furious. That makes it sound more exciting than it actually is. But there are moments, and the most contentious issues are around means of implementation, or MOI. What are we talking about when we talk about means of implementation? Well, we're talking a lot about money, resources. The financing for development process, or FFD process, how many of you have participated in FFD processes before or have followed them? Oh goodness, okay. So it's very technical, and I am not a technician in this area, so I'm not going to get into the details. But as I mentioned, it's a parallel process. It's intersecting with post-2015 sometimes. And the key issues in the means of implementation debate are: how do we mobilize adequate financial resources? ODA, private sector money, financial flows. How do we transfer and develop technology? How do we build capacity? What are the partnerships that we need? And what is the role of local governments in implementing a sustainable development agenda? Because in the end, these agendas get implemented on the ground by you, by your governments, by your local governments. One of the key issues, there are a couple of key issues in this means of implementation debate that you should probably know about, is there's a real question about who's providing the money and what's the role of middle-income countries. And this, in part, is why South Africa and Brazil are so important in this debate. Who's providing the money and who's obligated to resource? Is it only the developed countries? What about the middle-income countries? I'm getting close to the end. Who are the key actors in this process? So I mentioned, we've got, in the New York process, we've got co-facilitators of different negotiations. Kenya and Ireland are the co-facilitators of the post-2015 process. South Africa is crucial as the chair of the G77 and also as the most powerful African leader in the negotiations. Brazil has been very vocal in the negotiations, allies itself with the G77, and obviously is part of the BRICS. Ethiopia is the host of the Financing for Development Conference, and as such has responsibility for that July conference to produce a good outcome. So Ethiopia is very important. India has been difficult in this area, which probably won't come as a surprise. In fact, more difficult than China, which may come as a surprise. Norway and Guyana are co-facilitators of the financing for development process, and Denmark and Uganda are the co-organizers of the UN General Assembly Summit in September 2015, and as such, have a great interest in making sure that summit is successful. South Africa, where is South Africa in all of this? Well, it's not clear that the ambassador in New York, the South African ambassador in New York, is actually representing the positions in capital. I actually ran into the ambassador on Monday at the UN, and he promised, the South African ambassador, and he promised to meet with me, so I'm very excited to go back and talk to him after I've talked to you. But it's not clear who in Pretoria is leading the charge. What are the ministries in country that are involved in developing South Africa's positions, and whether or not Ambassador Mamabalo in New York is actually repeating anything that's going on in Pretoria. That's just not clear. So what he said in New York is common but differentiated responsibilities, this idea that governments are responsible depending upon their economic positions. It applies to post-2015 as it does to financing. In other words, the governments with more money and the governments who have created the problems have a greater responsibility to fund and to address the development deficits. South Africa has talked about the role of national government as crucial, and so we should hold him to that by talking to folks in Pretoria. He's talked about how the post-2015 development agenda should essentially be a developing countries and middle-income countries agenda. And he's talked about how we really have to keep our eye on the focus on poverty eradication. I know I'm out of time, so I'm going to quickly say that South Africa has a national development plan that addresses some specific commitments that are relevant to us today. Their national development plan claims that it should ensure that all people live safely with an independent and fair criminal justice system, which is obviously relevant to the discourse today. I can talk later about Brazil's positions in case anybody is interested. And I just want to say that I think I want to end by talking about the role of those of you who are here today. Again, coming back full circle to where I started, which is, why should you care? Why should you care about this process? You should care about it because even though the negotiations in New York will produce an agenda that's important for all of the reasons that Rob mentioned before, it creates space. It puts our issues on the global agenda. It creates funding opportunities for our work. But it only is meaningful to us if we're able to implement that global agenda at the national level. And that is your responsibility and your obligation. And we have to start to talk about how you can hold your governments accountable in your capitals for actually thinking about implementing a new agenda in a way that advances the goals of justice, safety, and security. I will stop there, but I'm very happy to answer questions now or later. Thank you so much for your attention.